Mauri tu, mauri ora. Haumi e, hui e, tā iki e. On behalf of the Mental Health Foundation of New Zealand, I would like to welcome you here today to the Mauri tu, mauri ora webinar series, where we will be talking to prominent Māori leaders throughout the country, as well as those unaccustomed to being out the front, but are doing phenomenal work in the background. COVID-19 has impacted on the whole of community across Aotearoa, New Zealand. And part of that is the mental health and well-being of every single individual throughout the country. Today, I have a special guest here today, Sir Mason Durie. Many of you will know Sir Mason through his work. He's an author, he's a scholar, and he's a Māori health practitioner. And as our patron of the Mental Health Foundation, we are so lucky to have him present to you today. Sir Mason, I believe, was one of the first board members of the Mental Health Foundation, and he set it up back in the 70s. So without further ado, Sir Mason, welcome.
Kia ora, Michael. Kia ora whānau.
Kia ora tātou. Firstly, just to start on the light note, whānau, we've got a bit of a presentation from Sir Mason around his thoughts around COVID-19. And our topic we're going to speak on is whānau ora. But firstly, on a light note, Sir Mason, this is the new norm. And obviously, many of our kaumātua have gone into lockdown, whilst people in my generation have stepped forward to take the reins, where normally our kaumātua have taken those reins. So firstly, I wanted to know how it is going in your bubble.
Well, you'll find out soon enough what it's like to be in this age range, Michael. But the bubble for us has actually been quite a good experience. We've been at home, our children deliver food when we need it. But it's also been a good time to get things done, things that we perhaps hadn't done before. So basically, it's been okay for us.
And just looking around my age group, or let's put it between the ages of 18 and 50 years old, we've all had to step up. And many of my age group are doing these types of webinars. We're running tikanga and all that. What are your thoughts around that?
Well, I'm not in a hurry to step my age up much further. I think it makes sense that it's a good idea, because you'll be an older person eventually, and this is quite a good run for that opportunity. The question that I was thinking about is what is the impact of COVID-19 on Māori whānau? And that led me to think that this is not the first epidemic that we've endured. In the 1800s, there was a measles outbreak, a major measles outbreak in the South Island, which devastated people. But we've had other epidemics, and there are three particularly I wanted to focus on. One was the 1913 smallpox outbreak, and the 1918 influenza pandemic, and then the 1938 measles outbreak. When the smallpox outbreak occurred, it occurred after a missionary from America came to New Zealand, went up north to meet his people, thought he had chickenpox, but in fact it was smallpox, which was much more serious, and a number of cases began to emerge. There were 116 non-Māori cases and no deaths were reported, but there are 1,978 Māori cases and 55 deaths. So pretty clear there that under that epidemic or that outbreak, Māori were seriously disadvantaged. A similar pattern in 1918, that was the major flu epidemic after World War I, or sometimes called the Spanish flu. It came to New Zealand, as it did to many other countries right around the world. Large numbers of New Zealanders got the flu. The death rates were different. The non-Māori death rate was at a rate of 50 deaths per 10,000 people. The Māori death rate was 226 per 10,000 people. So again, a huge discrepancy there in death rates from that epidemic. And in 1938, the measles outbreak occurred. We've had a number of measles outbreaks, but this one was a significant one. And the non-Māori death rate there was 1.07, which meant there were 163 deaths. And the Māori death rate was 24 per 10,000, which was 212 deaths. That was for a population which was significantly lower than the national average. So you can see just from those three epidemics, the pattern has been, when there's been an epidemic, Māori do worse. If we just move on to look at what that might mean for COVID-19, there have been a number of predictions, and I think that they were accurate predictions, that Māori COVID-19 infection would be much higher than the nation generally. There's modelling had been done on that. We also took account of earlier trends. The expectation was that the Māori rates of infection and of death would be much higher than the rate of Māori in the population. So we make up at present about 15% of the population, and you would expect to see that the COVID impacts, the significance of COVID would be much higher than the 15%. But the most recent data, on the 10th of May, I should have mentioned, by the way, it's early days. We're not through this yet, but at this stage, the data shows that there have been about 126 Māori cases, which is only 8% of the total cases. So the total cases are 1494, and Māori make up 8% of those. You would have expected it to be 15% or much higher than 15%, but it hasn't. So that leaves the question as to why the rates are lower than expected. And it does suggest that there's been something else happening as well that has led to the lower rates. And that's what I just want to touch on a bit, what some of those might have been. So in the next slide there, we see that there have been, why are the rates for Māori lower than non-Māori when we would in the past have expected exactly the opposite? There are two possibilities. One is that Māori have relatively fewer people over the age of 70, and COVID-19 is particularly strong on, particularly harsh on people over the age of 70. So because there are fewer Māori in that age group, maybe that's one of the reasons why the Māori figures are lower. But the other possibility is that maybe actions have been taken that have shown to have positive results. And I'm referring not only to the government actions, but in particular to Māori actions. And I just want to talk a bit about those, what those actions might have been. So we all have heard pretty clearly about what the general population measures have been to prevent this from spreading: social distancing, hand washing, staying at home, living in bubbles, as much testing as we can do, and early intervention. Now, those measures have been applied right across the board to everyone. But even if they had been applied equally to everyone, you would still have expected Māori rates to be higher. That's been the pattern in the past, and we expected that that might have been the case. So I think Māori, as much as anyone, have been practicing those measures of social distancing and hand washing and staying at home as much as anyone. and yet our rates have been lower rather than higher. So is there anything else been happening that might have been an additional preventative measure that's not part of the general population? And there are 5 measures for avoiding infection that Māori have begun to take control of. One is whānau making decisions, whānau decision making, whānau support, whānau protection, whānau connections, and whānau workers. And all of these, what I've called case studies, are technically not case studies, but in all of these areas, the focus on whānau has been an important one. So I just want to look at those one at a time and see what to make of it. One of the early discussions we had before we went into lockdown on Ngāti Marae at Aorangi, which is a Ngāti Kauwhata Marae, which is close to Fielding and close to Palmerston, with some discussion about whether some people thought that with this coming up, maybe the marae would be a safe haven for people to go to. The feeling was that it wouldn't be safe, and in fact it could be unsafe because of the sleeping arrangements that we had, because of the eating arrangements. And so the whānau of the marae whānau agreed to close the marae, and we did that on March the 17th. Also advised against hongi. So this was a whānau decision that the marae should close, and it did, and it still is, but it closed on March the 17th. But within a fortnight, marae whānau throughout the country had adopted a similar approach. But the important point is the decision to close the marae and avoid hongi were made by whānau. They were not made elsewhere. These were made before the other efforts came in. A second and early initiative came from the Whānau Water Commissioning Agency, and very early on in this episode, end of March, the Whānau Water Commissioning Agency is very concerned about older whānau members, and the agency initiated a nationwide distribution of hygiene kits to whānau homes, and they focused especially where there were kaumata and queer. They took that to the health providers, Māori health providers, whānau water providers in both the North and South Islands, made up a whole lot of kits, and the navigators helped with the distribution. By the end of April, 90,000 packs had been distributed. Government funding to assist this was made available, 15 million, after the work had begun. The important point here is the Whānau Water Commissioning Agency took the initiative to work with our whānau. A third preventative measure came about with iwi leaders wanting to protect their whānau, and they particularly wanted to protect their whānau who were living in areas where there had been no infection, and they wanted to keep it that way. And so throughout the country, Whānau Apanui led the way. I think others followed, of having action stations on highways that were leading into Rohe, where there could be whānau at risk. And this gained quite a lot of publicity. Was it against the law or not against the law? The iwi perspective was, the focus of it was preventing illness for our old people and keeping our older people well. And that overrode any other consideration. It also recognised, I think, the fact that you can't separate wellness from the land on which people live. And so these action stations recognised also that there was a territorial concern that iwi had. But their particular emphasis was on keeping whānau well. Then we looked at the hugely important issue has been the way whānau have stayed connected, because in the lockdown situation, people get disconnected. They can't visit each other, can't be in contact. And this is where whānau have shown that online communication is a good way. It's not the perfect way, but it is a good way of keeping in touch with people living overseas. And a lot of our whānau still live overseas. Not everyone came home. But with whānau who might live just down the road but can't visit, the online connection is important. As we're seeing tonight, Zoom is an important way of keeping in touch, and I'm beginning to figure out how to use it. It's not every day. Te Pihopatanga Aotearoa has had karakia regularly online and through Zoom. There's been online kapahaka, people in their bubbles working with others to form sort of wide whānau participation, good health advice, te reo forums and fitness tikanga programs. The online media has been important. And we've seen online tangihanga. There's been at least 2 tangi that have occurred that are kept to the strict regulations of social distancing, but they were tangi nonetheless, and some of them were shared on social media. And there's been entertainment, and inevitably there's been online cooking shows. So keeping whānau connected by being online has been quite an important step in dealing with COVID-19. If whānau are not connected, then whānau are more vulnerable. And really, we've had some wonderful workers at the front line, whānau workers, who've brought on additional skills that they didn't previously think was in their territory. But COVID-19 testing, for example, we've seen whānau ora workers doing that on the front line. Flu vaccinations, antibiotic administration, reading temperatures. We frequently see this happening of people as they drive through for mobile testing, and being able to give advice and make referrals. So I think this has been, having our own people at the front line has been a hugely important step to dealing with the COVID-19 situation. So a possibility, and remember I started out at the beginning of this wondering why Māori cases were lower than you might have expected. And the possibility that I've been emphasising, and which seems to be a reasonable one to me, although it's not proven, but it seems to be a reasonable one, is that we have lower rates of infection that you would have expected because of Māori leadership, and that leadership has always placed whānau at the centre. And it's given emphasis to whānau decision-making, whānau being supported, whānau being protected. That's where the action stations are important. Whānau having connections, and the online mode of connection has been really important. And whānau workers who are at the front line and are able to relate to Māori whānau in a way which makes sense to them. So my take on all of this is that if we are to have, in an epidemic of any sort, if we are to have lower rates of infection and death, certainly, that Māori leadership that puts whānau at the centre is going to be one way of doing it. That's the only conclusion I can reach at this point about why our rates are much lower than the national average.
Thank you, Papa. I just have a few questions in addition to your presentation around whānau ora, and obviously you've talked about whānau ora quite a bit. Well, the whole presentation has been about whānau ora. I wanted to look at the impact of COVID-19 on our people, especially the cultural impact. And you mentioned tangihanga, not being able to attend tangihanga, and the unresolved grief and loss there, not being able to attend the birth of your mokopuna, and being there to karanga the child into this world, and as well as the mass gathering. Do you have any thoughts around that?
Well, I think for the whānau who have been in those situations, the remorse is pretty high, and the disappointment has been very high. guess always you've got to weigh that up against staying safe and staying well. And it's a difficult decision to make. But I think there are ways around it. And one of the tangi that I alluded to earlier on showed that there was a way of doing that where the social distancing was observed, the numbers were observed, but the tangi took place in a way that went quite a long way to endorsing, giving people an opportunity to express their grief and their respect for the person who had passed away. So I think there were ways of doing it. Just saying a blanket statement, no tangi, no funerals with 10 people, there is an opportunity, I think, to be a little more innovative than that because it's a fairly harsh measure.
Yes, and I know when the government went hard and they went early to flatten the curve, there's another curve that's going on, and that's the curve of mental distress that is likely to occur across all our communities. Do you have any thoughts about flattening that curve as we move into the recovery period, as we move into post-COVID?
I think that the support that we've shown over the last 6 weeks to whānau needs to continue, but in a slightly different form. That at present we've been looking at sort of the physical well-being of people. That's where the hygiene kits come out, the food parcels come out. That's all looking at staying well physically, and I think that's the important approach at this stage. But I think as we go on, we'd expect to see that there'll be a greater need for, particularly for whānau frontline workers, to be looking at the mental health complications or implications of COVID-19. That will require, I think, a hugely additional input into the Māori workforce. I'm not saying exclusively Māori workforce, because many people will see other workers, but I think that at a whānau level, addressing mental distress is probably best handled by people who know the whānau and who know how to do that. So I see that this will be an extra demand on whānau water navigators, on whānau providers of all sorts, social, economic, health, education providers. There'll be an extra demand that we need to be ready for. And that to get ready for that may mean that we need to be doing some rethinking about the sorts of skills that we'll need to do that. Just as we thought about having hygiene packs, important, that was for the physical health, food packs, important for physical health. So what are the skills that we now have to introduce to help people, to help alleviate mental distress?
Thank you, Papa. I started on a light note, and I sensed I got a bit of banter back from you. But anyway, I just wanted to end on a light note, because we talk about the old norm and the new norm, and we're dropping down the levels from level 4 to 3, and now we are likely to drop into level 2. What are you most looking forward to, knowing that you've had a good break, because it takes 6 months to book you in advance? So I just wanted to get your thoughts around that.
About what I'm looking forward to?
Yes.
Well, it'll be quite good to see the mokos in person rather than on social media. Although that's been quite interesting, having quiz nights with our whānau, with everyone in their own bubble, giving the wrong answers to questions. So I think that's one thing I look forward to. The other thing is that what COVID-19 has taught us, I think, is much more to being well than just avoiding a sickness. It's got to do with friendship. I think the theme of kindness has been an important one. And I think we ought not to be in a great rush to go back to the normal way of expecting that people are going to be self-sufficient, of expecting that people don't need support. We just need to be thinking a little bit more broadly than that.
E te matua, I just wanted to really thank you for offering your time here to talk to everyone throughout the country. It's been an absolute pleasure, and You're one of these persons that have been an essential worker prior to lockdown for all of Māoridom throughout the country, and I'd just like to thank you. E te whānau, if you have any concerns that have been raised in the show today, please contact 1737 if you have any concerns, and a trained counsellor will be there to support you. We will be running other video and kōrero over the next time. So e te whānau tēnei, ake te mihi kia koutou, a katoa, nō reira, me mihi.